Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're embarking on a deeply reflective, honestly pretty powerful journey through one of the absolute most significant psychological works of the 20th century. We are exploring Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Now, this isn't just some dry recounting of history, right? It's a profoundly compassionate look into the absolute extremes of human suffering and the astonishing discoveries about the human spirit that actually emerged from it. Frankl survived the unimaginable horrors of Nazi concentration camps, and from that darkest of nights, he brought back a light that has literally transformed how we understand human resilience. Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand Frankl's work, we have to confront a haunting central premise. Think about it. When every single possession is lost, every value is destroyed, when you're suffering from unimaginable hunger, bone-chilling cold and brutality, and you're hourly expecting extermination, how does one find life worth preserving? What keeps a human being going when absolutely everything they know and love is violently stripped away?
So let's look at Section 1, the search for meaning, and how Frankl's logotherapy compares to traditional psychology. And this brilliantly illustrates the core shift here. You see, Frankl wasn't just a survivor, he was already a brilliantly trained psychiatrist. His harrowing experiences in the camps ultimately forced a massive paradigm shift in psychology. Before Frankl, the dominant voice was Sigmund Freud, who basically argued that humanity's primary driving force was the will to pleasure, focusing on avoiding pain, satisfying unconscious motives, that sort of thing. But Frankl, being tested in the ultimate crucible of suffering, realized something entirely different. He argued that our deepest, most fundamental drive is actually the will to meaning. We are driven by this profound need to find meaning and responsibility in our existence, even when all pleasure is completely 100% gone.
To explain how he arrived at this conclusion, we're going to map out the typical psychological journey of a camp inmate, descending into utter darkness before finding a path back to the light. Frankl identified three sequential psychological phases. First, the initial shock of admission. Second, the emotional apathy of the entrenched camp routine. And finally, the complex psychology following liberation and spiritual freedom.
Let's start at the beginning. Phase 1. The shock. The illusion of reprieve and the stripping of existence.
It all begins with that harrowing arrival at Auschwitz in a suffocatingly crowded train car. And upon arriving, something incredibly strange happens to the human brain. Frankl noted a psychological condition known as the delusion of reprieve. When those train doors opened, the prisoners saw a receiving squad of older inmates who actually looked relatively well-fed, speaking various languages, some even laughing. And kind of like a drowning man clutching at a straw, the condemned cling to this wild illusion that maybe things won't be so bad, that they might be saved at the very last second, just because they saw these healthy-looking men.
But, as you can guess, that illusion is violently shattered. Frankl describes this frantic, terrifying process where they were driven into rooms, given exactly 2 minutes to completely undress, and then shoved under showers. They were shaved, so not a single hair was left on their bodies. Frankl even tried to smuggle in his life's work, a scientific manuscript hidden in his coat, but it was confiscated. He realized in that moment he had to completely strike out his whole former life. They were stripped down to nothing but their, as he called it, ridiculously naked lives. No name, no past, no possessions whatsoever.
Which brings us to Phase 2, emotional apathy, the blunting of emotions as a protective shell. Now that initial shock, it just cannot be sustained by the human mind. To survive the daily horrors, the constant beatings, the unending sight of sickness and death, the prisoner's mind had to build a protective shell. It was a kind of emotional death. Because of the severe starvation and physical degradation, the prisoner's inner lives regressed to a highly primitive level. Frankl noted that their dreams and rare conversations weren't about, grand philosophical ideals anymore. They were entirely consumed by simple sustenance. They dreamt endlessly of bread, cake, cigarettes, and warm baths. Their whole mental life centered almost entirely around the desperately needed calories their bodies were practically devouring themselves to replace.
So the crucial point here is that in this brutal environment, looking weak meant certain death. The prisoners used this camp slang term, Muslim, for a man who looked miserable, sick, and emaciated. And every prisoner knew that sooner or later a Muslim would absolutely be selected for the gas chambers. The only way to survive was to literally shave with a piece of broken glass just to get ruddy cheeks, to stand smart, walk smart, and basically fake looking fit for hard labor.
In this numb state of apathy, the prisoners experienced what Frankl calls negative happiness. True joy didn't exist anymore, but a bizarre kind of happiness was found simply in the absence of worse suffering. For instance, Frankl shares this unforgettable anecdote. Prisoners crammed into a train car did a literal dance of joy just because they realized their transport train bypassed the dreaded camp of Mauthausen and was heading to Dachau instead, a camp that, at the time anyway, didn't have a gas chamber. Happiness was entirely redefined as simply avoiding the absolute worst.
This leads us to a fascinating shift: the inner spiritual refuge, deepening of the spiritual life amidst physical primitiveness.
Amidst this emotional death, Frankl observed a stunning paradox. Delicate prisoners sometimes actually survived better than robust individuals because they retreated into a rich inner spiritual life. Their physical bodies were failing, sure, but their inner selves remained powerfully protected. For example, one freezing morning, as the men were stumbling through the icy darkness to a work site, being beaten by guards, Frankl began to commune with the mental image of his wife. He didn't even know if she was still alive, but it suddenly ceased to matter. In that utterly desolate moment, he grasped the greatest secret of human thought. The salvation of man is through love and in love. He realized that even when a man has literally nothing left in this world, he can still know bliss through the contemplation of his beloved. This intensified inner life allowed the prisoners to experience the beauty of art and nature as they never had before. Frankl describes a moment when a fellow prisoner actually rushed into their hut, telling them to come outside just to see a glowing Bavarian sunset. Standing there in their rags, looking at the sky alive with steel blue and blood-red clouds, one prisoner whispered how beautiful the world could be. Another time, Frankl found a profound, silent connection with a bird that just flew down and perched on a heap of dirt right in front of him.
So put yourself in this unimaginable position for just a moment. Surrounded by death, starved, beaten, completely stripped of all identity. How did they bear it? What was the psychological anchor that kept them from simply running into the electrified barbed wire, which, tragically, was the most common form of suicide in the camps?
Now, what's really interesting here is the most famous philosophical takeaway of Frankl's book. Quoting Nietzsche, he realized, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." Surviving required making a larger sense out of the seemingly senseless suffering. The prisoners who survived were the ones who could point to a future goal, maybe a loved one waiting for them, or a life's task that only they could complete.
And that brings us to the last human freedom, choosing one's attitude in a given set of circumstances.
This is Frankl's ultimate game-changing revelation. The environment, no matter how oppressive, tyrannical, or brutal, does not completely dictate a human being's inner choices. That final freedom is the ability to choose your internal attitude. When you encounter an unchangeable fate, when you absolutely cannot change the situation, you are challenged to change yourself. You choose how you will carry your burden. Frankl notes that while only a few prisoners achieve this high moral standard, even one single example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength can rise above his outward fate. You can retain your inner human dignity regardless of the horrors surrounding you.
Frankl references Dostoevsky here. "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." He shares this incredibly moving story of a young woman dying in the camp. She was actually cheerful, telling Frankl she was grateful fate hit her so hard because it made her take spiritual things seriously. Her only friend in the world was a chestnut tree she could see through her window. She told Frankl she spoke to the single blossom on the branch, and the tree replied to her, saying, "I am here, I am here, I am life, eternal life." She was entirely worthy of her suffering, maintaining her spiritual greatness right to the very end.
Let's move to how this builds into our reality today. Overcoming the existential vacuum, logotherapy in the modern world.
Taking these hard-won lessons from the 1940s, Frankl formalized logotherapy to address our modern, everyday struggles. In the camps, a provisional existence, living without a future goal, destroyed prisoners both mentally and physically. Well, today he argues that a lack of purpose creates a very similar, dangerous void, which he calls the existential vacuum. He points to phenomena like the Sunday neurosis. That's the depression people feel when the busy work week is finally over, and the absolute void and lack of content within their own lives suddenly becomes terrifyingly obvious. And this existential vacuum, it doesn't always look like sadness. It actually wears many masks today. Frankl argues that depression, aggression, and addiction are all deeply rooted in this lack of meaning. When people can't find their will to meaning, they compensate. They chase a will to money, a will to power, or they dive into rampant sexual compensation. Logotherapy seeks to cure this by helping individuals identify their unique responsibilities, weaving the broken threads of their lives into a firm, undeniable pattern of meaning.
As you've seen, the human spirit can withstand the darkest, most unimaginable suffering, but only if it holds on to a purpose. So I want to leave you with this deeply provocative challenge. If Viktor Frankl could find eternal meaning in the mud and blood of a concentration camp, take a real look at your own life. What is your why? What is the will to meaning in your life right now? Think about that, and let it guide you forward. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.